Okay, everyone, welcome back. I'm going to follow up. I think my previous recording kind of gave you an outline of chapter one, the different sections, and what I felt was important. What I'm going to try to do today is look at the PowerPoint with you. So, as you prepare to follow me, if you have your PowerPoint, it would be helpful. And as I'm going through it, just understand that I'm probably giving you a few little test-taking tips of what's important. So on the one of the first PowerPoints, I'm looking at under definition of adolescence. While there's different ways of measuring it, this author, Santrock, John Santrock, he believes that somewhere between the age of 10 and 13 years old is the onset of what we call adolescence. Well, that should tell you that if he believes it happens somewhere around 10 to 13 years old, then that's probably about the time puberty starts, and that's a biological perspective. So keep that in mind as you're preparing for test number one. Then we get straight into the history of adolescence, realizing, of course, that this term did not exist where the author picks it up, but at some point in our history it became a new term, specifically at the turn of the century here in America. And so I'm going to go quickly through some of these periods of history. Specifically, the author starts with Plato, a Greek philosopher who believed that he noticed that these older kids seemed to be capable of reasoning and problem solving, and that was a distinction that children did not seem to have. They were much more concrete, whereas these older kids seemed to be able to think things through, problem solve, and so on. So the ability to reason or problem solve to him was a sign of what we call adolescence. Within that same paragraph, you talk about Aristotle, another Greek philosopher. He agreed with Plato, but the truth is he added another dimension to it. So what I would highlight is decision making, or self-determination, the ability as we get older to make our own decisions, accept the consequences of our decisions, and that's something that Aristotle noticed. The next PowerPoint talks about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, you're going to see the term miniature adults. What they mean by that is there were no distinct stages of development. Everyone was treated the same, whether you were a kid or an adult. You were expected to get out there and work, and you were punished harshly if you don't. Well, obviously, today we know that we have different stages of development from infancy, childhood, early, late, adolescence, early, late, and so on. But not during the Middle Ages, so it was a pretty tough time to be an adolescent. When you get to early America, the turn of the century, just understand that somewhere around 1890 into 1920, during that little window of time, that's when people really started taking notice of this group of young people called adolescents. And the reason for that was the Industrial Revolution, in which we had this booming economy, and parents started wanting their kids to go to school so they could get better jobs because they had a better education. Well, the more kids that went to school, the more we started realizing that these kids have an influence on each other, and parents were a little more concerned as to how to deal with their kids and their environment and their peers and the peer pressure they were coming under. So that's kind of where you are with that. Well, one of the people that you really need to know about is a guy named G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was an expert. He did scientific research and had a lot of information. In fact, wrote a book in 1904 about adolescents, their behavior, and why they behave the way they do. And so he was the prominent figure regarding adolescence. So parents were looking to him for advice and guidance. What he came up with was a concept that he called storm and stress. And what he meant by that was that when you have children in your home, it's going to be pretty easy sailing. If we're going to use an analogy of a ship sailing across the ocean, it's going to be pretty smooth sailing. They're going to be fairly compliant, and the parents are going to be able to expect obedience from their kids. He says when kids experience the onset of puberty, because of the increase in hormones, they're going to go through a lot of emotional mood swings, up and down, happy, angry, and so on. He calls that storm and stress. So if you could follow the analogy of the ship sailing across the ocean and it's smooth sailing, then along comes a storm. He says that storm's going to last for a couple of years, and that's this period we call adolescence, while the parents are having to deal with these mood swings, this sense of rebelliousness and trying to seek out their identity and so on. He says, but eventually they get past that and puberty is over, and that it's going to be smooth sailing again. So just, especially if you didn't, when I suggested, go ahead and highlight that. Around that same time, again, we're around 1900 here, around the same time, another figure comes along in your text, Margaret Mead. Again, if I tell you someone's name, you need to know their philosophy, their concepts, or their theories. Margaret Mead did not believe that G. Stanley Hall was correct in his assumption that you were going to necessarily experience storm and stress because of puberty. Her disagreement was that it was because of the pressure that was put on kids by forcing them to go to school, get in the rat race, make good grades so they could get a good job. And she said that's why they had storm and stress. In other words, she didn't disagree that they experienced storm and stress, but that it wasn't because of puberty, but rather a social factor, meaning the pressure that was put on them by their parents and their teachers to claw their way to the top. And so to be able to disprove someone's theory, you have to be able to go and either replicate their research or you have to be able to show they're wrong. So what Margaret Mead decided to do was go to Samoa. Samoa is an island in the South Pacific where they had no industrial revolution, they had no formal education and no rat race. She wanted to see if teenagers in Samoa, a fairly tribal group at that time, if those kids experienced storm and stress. Well, obviously her hypothesis would be if there was no storm and stress, it was because there was no industrial revolution. And in fact, when she completed her research living among the Samoan people, that is exactly what she concluded, was that the adolescents in Samoa did not go through storm and stress. Again, because they did not have the pressure, even though they went through puberty just like any other kid. That's the point. So when she returned to the United States, she reported on her findings, and some other people who did not necessarily agree with her, they followed her research up, and they went to Samoa and did their own research, came back and said, not so quick there, Margaret. It appears that kids in Samoa have experienced storm and stress like any other kids. And so what they determined, and again, when I tell you put a check mark by it or highlight it, obviously I'm suggesting that you look it up in the book, but what they found or assumed was that her research was not objective and she was biased. She saw what she wanted to see, and therefore it skewed her results in the direction she wanted it to go rather than remain objective. And so her work was criticized, and people tended to fall back on G. Stanley Hall's concept or theory of storm and stress. From this point on, I'll just kind of hit on the highlights of decades during this period of history. Again, just pay attention that each section has something that you can see as a key term. By the 1900s, our government passed legislation mandating that kids went to school. In other words, now it was going to be the law of the land. The purpose of passing that legislation was to increase the number of young people graduating from high school and decrease the number of young people in the workforce. So they wanted a more educated workforce to continue the Industrial Revolution in technology, which is exactly what they accomplished. So put a star by it again or highlight it. between 1900 and 1930, over the next 3 decades, there was a 600% increase in the number of young people graduating from high school. And so the legislation that was passed did in fact accomplish what it set out to accomplish. Uh, in your book, you'll see they call that the inventionist view. The inventionist view is a socio-historical event. It happened at a certain period in the history of our country that impacted how we dealt with young people. Anything that happens at a specific time impacting some group of people is called socio-historical rather than socio-cultural. Margaret Mead's work is an example of socio-cultural. She studied the culture of the people and their social interaction, their relationships, and so on. But the inventionist view, or the legislation passed, was socio-historical. As you move forward, of course, you can jump to decades. The 1920s was the Great Depression, very difficult time to be an adolescent. The 1930s, following the Great Depression, the kids were more passive and not so much outgoing. By the 1950s, World War II had ended in 1945, so the economy was booming. People were returning home. The suburbs were sprawling and growing, so it was a good time to be a teenager. They call it the silent generation because there weren't really a lot of turmoil or problems. You didn't have the drugs and the revolting that we had in the 60s, which of course brings us to the next decade. And the 60s involved a lot of problematic behavior with rioting, the civil rights movement, the marching against the Vietnam War, against the establishment, the onslaught of drugs in our culture, and the divorce rate, and the families struggling. So a lot of negatives was happening in the 60s that young people had to deal with. After that, the author just wraps it all up and says that following that period, young people pretty much became more focused on higher education, what you needed to do to get a better job, and so on. Now, I'm going to move to a section in your PowerPoint. It's headed up, it's called stereotyping. Stereotyping is when you try to simplify a group of people, in our case, by just lumping them all into one category or labeling them. It's your simple belief assumptions about some group. But pay more attention to the next paragraph in your book, and it's called the adolescent generalization gap. It's a guy named Joseph Adelson. Joseph Adelson took this term stereotyping, but he specifically applied it to teenagers only. Stereotyping can be about any group. It can be about a religious group. It can be about an ethnic group. It can be about a socioeconomic group. But adolescent generalization gap is only about teenagers. And he said we have a tendency, once we become adults, to try to label these young people. And the problem with that is that we are basing that on a limited amount of information and a fairly small group of young people. What I mean by that is that 20% of the adolescent population gets the attention of the entire population. They are the at-risk group. They're the ones that are getting in trouble. If you see it on the news about violence in schools, it's really about that high-risk group and not the 80% of kids who are just going about their daily routine. But because it's so highly reported, we would think the entire group of young people were violent, when in reality it's a small group. And so that is called the adolescent generalization gap. To make a generalization about a group of people is when you take a small sample of an entire population and then you generalize those findings to the entire population. And he says that's what we have a tendency to do. those young people are disrespectful. All those kids today are lazy. That would be an adolescent generalization gap. I'm now on the PowerPoint headed up as today's adolescence context. Pay attention to the definition of a context. It's the setting in which development occurs. And so you're looking at a kid maybe growing up in the inner city, high crime, dangerous neighborhood. That would be his context. And it'll certainly affect his behavior and his values and how he sees the world. But when you do research, social context involves a lot more than that. It involves people's cultures, where you might want to compare teenagers from a Western culture to teenagers from an Eastern culture. You could also look at social context from the point of ethnicity. Some ethnic groups are going to require that their kids continue to embrace their culture, their language, their ethnic heritage, and the way they dress. Or some are going to allow their kids to assimilate into the Western culture, and that would involve their ethnic background. And finally, their gender. So you might include whether they treat boys differently than they treat girls. So keep that in mind as you're taking test questions, whether the question is about a boy or a girl. The next major section is nature of development. I'm not going to spend too much time on the first 4 periods of development because that deals with childhood development, and of course that's a different course. Our course focuses primarily on adolescence, and so if you're following in the book, what I want you to pay attention to here is early adolescence and late adolescence. Early adolescence, you will pick it up because it's going to be preoccupation with body image. They're going through puberty, their bodies are changing, they're going through growth spurt, and I'll get into that in chapter 2, and they're going through sexual maturation. Well, this fascinates young people, so they spend a great deal of time and energy paying attention to the changes that they're going through, and that's a biological process. So that would help you to define or identify that a kid is in early adolescence. If they're walking past a mirror and always looking at themselves to see if they've grown bigger, or if a boy's looking to see if he's putting on muscle mass and so on. By the time a kid reaches high school, somewhere around the age of 15, the developmental period that the author discusses is late adolescence. Late adolescence, I would circle or put a star by identity exploration. By this time, according to the author, they've gotten over all the interest of puberty, because that's kind of over with now, and they start focusing on their future, their values, their career, what are they going to do with their education, and so on. And that would be late adolescence. Identity exploration. What do I believe? What do I think? And so on. The other 2 areas I would pay attention to, make a note, is emerging adults. Today, we realize that a lot of young people do not move into independent living like they did a few decades ago, but they rather are kind of transitioning from adolescence to adulthood. And so that transition is called emerging adults. Simply put, they're still somewhat dependent on their parents for some sort of resources, income, their help pay tuition, whatever they're doing. So keep that in mind. And the only way your author says you are completely an adult, and again, we're not talking legal, we're talking social processes, is when you're totally independent and capable of accepting all responsibility for yourself. Well, that's about as much time as I want to take today. And again, Monday I'll try to finish up the PowerPoint, and then sometime later in the week we'll review and get you ready for your first test. Thank you.